Iran says its new package of proposals has the potential to offer a breakthrough in a decade-long dispute over Tehran's nuclear program. Will the P5+1 agree to lift the crippling sanctions on Tehran? How does Iran intend to pursue its policy of transparency? This is the debate.
Switzerland, Geneva, the United Nations European headquarters. The venue of the fresh round of negotiations between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany. All eyes and lenses are zooming in on this table. Though it was Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif who opened the first session, the Iranian delegation was headed by Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and was there with a new package of proposals. 2 rounds of talks were held on Tuesday, as Iran's new proposals had changed the atmosphere and the tone of the talks, and drawn a positive reaction from the United States, the European Union, Russia, Britain, France, China and Germany.
We presented our proposal in a very positive environment, and the reaction was good. The climate of the meeting was very good and very constructive.
Michael Mann, spokesman for EU's Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, also described the talks as different, cordial and positive. Underlining the new mood, the Iranian negotiators say both sides have set a common objective to resolve the disputes over Iran's nuclear energy program. Iran says it's also put forth a mechanism to ensure this goal is achieved.
We believe we can achieve our objective of guaranteeing Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy, including enrichment, as well as giving guarantees about the solely peaceful nature of this program. Recognizing Iran's right to development, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, using the IAEA's verification mechanisms, international cooperation for recognition of Iran's rights, removal of all multi- and unilateral sanctions against Iran, cooperation on topics of mutual concern and interest.
Iran insists it's developing nuclear energy exclusively for peaceful purposes, but the US and Israel accuse Tehran of seeking atomic bombs. Israel, the only possessor of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, wants to see Iran's nuclear program rolled back altogether. Just days before the talks started, Tel Aviv warned the West against easing pressure on Iran. Iranian negotiators say snubbing Israeli rhetoric is a test of how the US and its allies are serious in reaching a deal.
These negotiations have their own enemies who are active in the region and in the US. At the top is the Zionist regime and its lobby. It's up to the other side to show its seriousness in the talks and to prevent the Zionist regime's destructive role and stop allowing others to define the agenda.
In case of a quick breakthrough, Tehran is demanding that the sanctions imposed by the West on the nation be scrapped. The country has been targeted by a series of multi- and unilateral sanctions over its nuclear program since 2006. All the pressure, despite Iran's insistence that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes only. Even a religious decree by leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, bans the development and stockpiling of atomic weapons. Moreover, numerous reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, reports that Iran has not diverted its nuclear program toward military use.
You're watching the debate. Joining me now live from Tehran is Mr. Mohammad Marandi, University of Tehran professor. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Marandi.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to welcome our guest from Washington, Mr. Patrick Basham, founding director of the Democracy Institute. I'll start my first question with Mr. Marandi here in Tehran. Now, Professor Marandi, Iran has called its new package, as you may know, ending an unnecessary crisis and opening new horizons. Why is Iran, first of all, calling this an unnecessary crisis, and how close are the sides to new horizons?
I believe, basically, the Iranians believe that from the very start, this problem has been manufactured by forces that are highly influenced by the Israeli lobby and by forces in general that are highly antagonistic towards Iran in the United States. When the nuclear crisis or the nuclear dossier became a major issue, the United States and its allies said that there was evidence that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. And it turned out that after a number of years, when the IAEA was involved in Iran, all the key issues, all the key questions that were asked, according to Mr. al-Baradei, had been responded to adequately. And if you recall, after the IAEA felt that the key issues had been responded to, then we saw the famous laptop with the fabricated information that was put forth, and new accusations were made against Iran. And it was becoming more and more clear to the Iranians that the issue is not something that the United States at that time wanted to resolve. They wanted to keep the nuclear issue as a serious problem, so that the United States could use it to put pressure on Iran for a host of reasons. Because of Iran's support for Palestinian groups, its opposition to apartheid in Palestine. But after 10 years now, we see that the Iranians continue to enrich uranium, that there never has been any evidence whatsoever to show that Iran's nuclear program has been anything but peaceful, and that even Western intelligence organizations have said repeatedly that the Iranians are not pursuing a nuclear weapons program.
Well, Mr. Marandi, sorry for stopping you there. Before you go to the next part of your response, I'd like to bring in our guest from Washington to have his idea specifically on what you said there. Mr. Basham in Washington, Mr. Marandi here in Tehran is telling us that this problem has been intentionally manufactured by the other side. And we know now at this stage that Iran's deputy foreign minister said both sides have put forth a common objective, and that is settling the dispute. Do you think that those who say the issue could have been dealt with a long time ago are right, and that what's needed here is the political will for this issue to be resolved?
Well, I think those who say the issue could have been dealt with a long time ago are right in the sense that we would all, I think on both sides, on all sides, have preferred that to be the case, but it isn't necessarily the case that it was possible to do so. I think that although certainly I appreciate the argument that the Western powers' concern is manufactured, I do think that the available evidence suggests that Western leaders genuinely believe, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, that Iran's intentions are not what the Iranian government says they are, peaceful versus military. That doesn't mean that the Western leaders are correct, but it's important to stress that that is what they believe to be the situation, because that predetermines their actions. Because what we're really talking about here is a very complicated, high-stakes chess match. But it's a chess match that's made even more complicated by the fact that there is almost total distrust between the two sides.
Well, Mr. Basham,
so not only are both sides...
Are you suggesting then that the concerns that you're talking about are real concerns, or are they manufactured concerns then? Because it's, of course, the basis for all the dispute in the first place.
No. I think that, to my knowledge, all of those individuals and governments who are party to the sanctions on Iran and to staying tough on Iran on the nuclear question are genuine in their conviction and their belief that Iran is pursuing a military end to its nuclear program. That is what they believe to be the case. Whether history will end up telling us that that was the case or not, that is what they believe, and therefore their actions can be seen as predictable based on that fundamental assumption. You know, it's analogous to the fact that the Iranian government is distrustful of the Americans' motives, especially in regard to Israel's role in ensuring that America maintains its opposition to Iran's nuclear program. You know, both sides are assuming the worst and the least of the other. And as a consequence, we are 10 years later still negotiating on the edges of this problem rather than towards the center and where actually a solution may be found.
Well, Ms. Marandi, I'd like to have your response to that, and also how Iran is intending to build the trust that our guest there is speaking about.
Well, really, it's not Iran that has to build trust if we want to look at it objectively. The Iranians actually halted the nuclear program, the enrichment cycle, completely for roughly 2 years. They implemented the additional protocol, and there were intrusive inspections. The United States actually misused that period, and we saw that elements within the IAEA were carrying out espionage in Iranian military installations with regards to programs that had nothing to do with the nuclear program. But still, the Iranians, in order to create trust and to alleviate any concerns that Western governments had, they allowed this to happen. Even at a time when the United States had just occupied Iraq, it was behaving in a very aggressive manner, and Iran was called the nexus of evil. The Iranian government, in the eyes of many, appeased the United States, and we got nothing in return. On the other hand, to say that, you know, for Western leaders, whether they're honest or not, to say that they believe that the ultimate aim of the Iranian nuclear program is not peaceful, they have to provide evidence of that. You cannot condemn a person to jail because because you think that one day in the future he may commit a crime. Western countries allow the Israeli regime to have nuclear weapons, to use chemical weapons, to use illegal weapons in its multiple wars in Lebanon and Gaza. Yet the Iranians, who've never attacked any country, they've been a victim of chemical weapons that were provided to Saddam Hussein by the United States, by the Europeans, and with the help of the United States, they were used against the Iranian people. Yet Iran itself never used chemical weapons, and I think the fact that the Iranians have never even used or produced chemical weapons shows that the Iranian hands are much cleaner than those of Western countries or the Israeli regime.
Well, let's put that case to Mr. Basham there in Washington. Iran has been taking confidence-building measures. That's what I guess there in Tehran is saying. We know, for instance, the additional protocol, the further inspections by the IAEA, the fuel cycle issue, etc. The thing is, why does the West insist that Iran should be more transparent, should be building more confidence? I mean, what does the West expect from Iran in order for these sanctions to be lifted?
It's a great question. I don't know if there's a great answer. The problem really comes down to distrust, and it comes down to the assumptions on the Western side. As my fellow guest has pointed out, you know, in a very calm and rational way, those assumptions may not necessarily all be correct, but we have to face the political reality that those are the base assumptions that the Western world is working from. Therefore, rightly or wrongly, the trust level, where that bar is set vis-a-vis Iran, from a Western perspective, is very, very high. Now, your guest in Tehran would say, well, it's ridiculously high. And I appreciate and understand why he's saying that. But the reality is, it is very high. This has also made it that much more difficult by the fact that the two most obvious choices for Western policymakers, particularly America, are either to militarily intervene and prevent Iran's nuclear program from continuing, and end the argument, or to simply leave well alone and let Iran do whatever Iran wants to do. Neither one is politically sellable here in America. Therefore, we continue to argue about sanctions and whether they should be more or less, et cetera, et cetera. So it's partly a discussion with Iran, but as importantly, it's a discussion here in America and in other Western nations internally about what on earth we should or shouldn't do.
Yes.
Because the truth is, we don't know what to do about Iran.
Well, that is a really good question as well. I'd like to put that to Mr. Marandi, but just before I do that, we're going to take a look at some of the comments that have been posted on our Facebook page, and we'll be right back.
It's an old offer with new faces. Iran's always been open to talks with West to end a standoff over its nuclear program. But now the West shows tendency to reach a deal during Rouhani's term for an evil purpose, to cultivate internal differences. Constructive, positive, useful. These are the adjectives we always hear every time there are talks between Iran and the West. But there is not any final deal. Both sides are sticking to their stances, and yet no deal will be struck unless there are some concessions. The sanctions against Iran are the main obstacle for reaching a deal right now. Lift the sanctions first and then test Tehran's intentions to ease international concerns. Sanctions and threats never lead to agreements, but to wars. Just be careful not to miscalculate the situation.
Some of the comments posted on our Facebook page. I'll go straight to our guest in Tehran, Ms. Marandi. Earlier on, our guest in Washington was telling us the US has two options, either the military option with Iran or leaving well alone and putting this aside. And this is now the question that the US or the P5+1 is facing. What do you think?
Well, I think the United States really is incapable of carrying out a successful war against Iran. We all, I think, recognize that by now. That what happened in Syria was a major event, one of probably the most important events that took place since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States, every time the American president, with the support of the Western media, tried to convince the U.S. public to engage even in a very small war against Syria, the population of the United States, to their immense credit, moved more and more against the idea and became more and more hostile towards the government, and even despite the fact that AIPAC tried to help Obama convince Congress, the mood in the United States was so negative that Congress didn't seem to have the capacity to support the war. On the other hand, the United States had become isolated internationally. So Iran is not Syria, it's not Iraq, and it's not Afghanistan. It's a country much more powerful, and it's right alongside the Persian Gulf. A war would be a global catastrophe, and no one would win. On the other hand, the Iranians have, the issue for Iran is not whether the United States leaves Iran alone or not. The point is that in the past, the United States has imposed sanctions on Iran before the nuclear standoff. In the 1990s, when the Iranians actually allowed an American oil company to exploit an oil field, Conoco, the United States slapped sanctions on Iran. And the United States also, in its laws that it has passed over the past couple of years, and Obama has never protested against them, it has, the sanctions right now are not simply linked to the nuclear program. Basically, the sanctions are linked to regime change, as the Americans like to put it.
Well, Ms. Marandi, I'm really sorry for stopping you. We are really short in time. I'd just like to get concluding remarks by both of you, and there are some important questions to be asked here. I guess in Washington, Mr. Basham, one issue that was mentioned also in the comments that we saw is how fair or balanced the situation between Iran and the P5+1 right now is. I mean, a lot of people are saying asking Iran to stop 20% enrichment, asking Iran to close the heavy water facility in Iraq, or to send its enriched uranium out of the country are not legally binding requests, then because Iran is a member of the NPT, and at the same time using sanctions and threats as a form of pressure. So do you think that this is just too much pressure on Tehran and the situation is not at all fair and balanced?
Well, it's too much pressure if you look at it from a sort of arguably a moral or an economic perspective, a humanitarian perspective. By that I mean, and the reason I generally oppose sanctions where they're applied in the world is because they hurt the people you're trying to help and arguably we don't have the right to do that and others don't have the right to do it to us. But in reality, Iran is in no small part attempting, as your guest in Tehran has indicated, to do the things that the West is requesting, because these sanctions, which have become more and more onerous, are truly biting in Iran. They are hurting people, the economy is in poor shape. And so I think the Iranian government, even though it believes that it is not morally required to go the extra mile, is now willing perhaps to go that extra mile because they need some of this economic pressure to be lessened. It's just simply the reality of trying to protect the Iranian people. Western powers know that those sanctions are biting. It appears to be the only card that they hold that they can play short of military intervention. So they're going to continue to keep the foot down on that gas pedal because it appears to be the only instrument that may work for them.
Yeah, and just quickly, Mr. Marandi, before we run out of time, a lot of people from the Western side especially have been saying this shows the sanctions have been working. This is why Iran has come to the negotiating table. Do you think Iran is even ready to discuss suspending enrichment of uranium at least to the 20% level? And does that mean Iran giving concessions?
I don't think that the sanctions have brought Iran to any negotiating table. The Iranians had already been negotiating before the recent sanctions and during the recent sanctions, and the Iranians, the previous head of the Supreme National Security Council, had a meeting on the sideline of the talks with the Deputy Secretary of State of the United States. So these talks had been taking place in the past. The Iranian position is basically that if we appease the United States, then basically the United States in future, whenever it wants something from Iran, it can again threaten the country with sanctions, and Iran would be forced to submit. And that is why the Iranians will not capitulate when it comes to its sovereignty. It will go the extra mile to bring about a more favorable atmosphere, but it will not relinquish its rights. And enrichment at 20% is something that the Iranians were basically forced to do in the first place because the Americans prevented Iran from importing the enriched fuel for the nuclear reactor that produces medical isotopes for cancer patients.
Thank you very much. Of course, a lot yet to discuss, but we have run out of time. Professor Mohammad Marandi with the University of Tehran with us here in the Iranian capital. Thank you, Mr. Marandi. A big thank you to our guest in Washington as well, Patrick Basham, founding director of the Democracy Institute. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us on another edition of The Debate. From me, it's goodbye.